one race we can look back on with more of a definitive tone is the gubernatorial election. You had Governor Kemp beat Stacey Abrams, the Democratic challenger, for a second time in a row. Guns did, as we mentioned earlier, seem to play more of a direct role in that race. What is your takeaway from that outcome?
I think that Governor Kemp certainly positioned himself way out ahead nationally on gun rights. I think that's usually a winning issue statewide in Georgia. I think it's extremely important to the base. And I think there's a growing number of people, especially, newer firearms owners, for whom this is an important issue. At the same time, there's something strange about the polling. I read a Atlanta Journal-Constitution poll that suggested that actually there was not even close to majority support among respondents to a poll for the permitless carry, and that in fact, support for it had been going up, but that it had peaked, at least so far, it's reached about 35%, and that 65% of voters suggested that they opposed permitless carry. I don't think that reflects people's general orientation to firearms rights. I think many people support firearms rights. As to whether or not they supported permitless carry per se, I think that's less clear. And so one of the takeaways from this, I think, might be that while Brian Kemp is sort of looking for ways to push the envelope on gun rights and to sort of expand them, he may have run out of things that have sort of broad appeal. And so, he's pushing something like permitless carry, where there are a lot of people who may be in favor of carry laws, but are nervous about permitless carry in the current context, who, when they think about all things considered, generally want to vote for somebody who's not going to impose new gun controls or gun restrictions. Stacey Abrams' agenda on this may not appeal to them, but it's not clear to me that they're actually big backers in large numbers of permitless carry. And so people may be voting sort of more generally on the idea of favoring gun rights and the right to carry, but not necessarily wanting to loosen up the ability to carry in terms of permitless carry. I don't know how that's going to play out. I mean, I think that this issue's settled in the state. We have this new law. It's not likely to be reversed. And Brian Kemp's been elected, so he's going to have time to work on, gun rights and other issues. But as to whether or not he wants to push the envelope a lot farther is not clear to me. I think also, we mentioned this before, he benefited a lot from being independent of Donald Trump. I think that this is a state that's purple, as you know, and that I think a lot of people feel good about what they would consider to sort of be a local Republican with local Republican focus, and not somebody who's plugged into the larger debates about what's going on in the Republican Party nationally. And I think that while there's a lot of support for Donald Trump in Georgia, we're talking about the margin here again, right? We're not talking about huge margins by which the governor won, and we're talking about a runoff in the Senate. People are looking for, what about those middle of the roaders? And a lot of those are Republicans who I think feel very comfortable with Brian Kemp, both because he's an incumbent. He generally stands for things they care about, including gun rights, and they're not that interested in drilling down in a lot of the details. And one thing they know about him that they like is he's independent of whatever might make them nervous in the National Republican Party. Yeah,
I think that's really good analysis. There's probably a lot of gray area here. It's not like, oh, well, it's obvious that because Kemp supported and passed permitless carry and Abrams opposed it, that's why the race went this way. I don't think that's too simplistic. Of course, there's a lot more interesting, tidbits to talk about there. And permitless carry doesn't poll very well, really nationwide or in most states, even where it's been implemented. But it is sort of, it does seem like some of these red states, they're getting to a point where, what do you do now? Like, you have a lot of the policies in place that gun rights advocates want, especially the ones that poll poll much better. And so,
plus you have Bruin.
Where do you go from there?
Right. You have the Supreme Court basically locking them in. Mm-hmm. It's going to be much harder to roll these back, not as a matter of politics, but as a matter of law. The Supreme Court's emerging Second Amendment jurisprudence really protects a lot of these advances. And I think that also creates a amount of security. The other thing is, there's a flip side of this story about Kemp being tied to Trump, which is, I think that, Kemp was independent. I think that worked in his favor. I think Stacey Abrams is seen as very tied to the Biden administration and to the National Democratic Party and the sort of, in particular, the progressive wing. And I'm not sure that served her as well in Georgia as independents might have. And so I think that in that sense, it was sort of a double boost. It seems to me that the candidates that have strong ties to sort of non-Georgia players, whether they're Democratic or Republican, probably are at a disadvantage at the margin to candidates who are seen as sort of more independent and focused just on Georgia.
Yeah. And I think the permitless carry thing is interesting too, because it doesn't poll well right now, but all of the governors who signed one into law won re-election this year. So it's not something that necessarily changes people's votes in the opposite direction, perhaps, or at least not at the very top of their list of things that would. And of course, the approval rating of permitless carry could increase over time if it doesn't lead to the sort of things that opponents, claim it will. Blood in the streets sort of rhetoric you get.
Yeah, I don't think anybody's voting against someone who voted for permitless carry, because the alternative isn't a candidate who says they want to keep the status quo, just roll back permitless carry. It's usually a candidate who wants to impose new gun restrictions, licensing, right, or stronger background checks or other things that people don't, aren't in favor of. So I just don't think that permitless carry is not going to be a problem in that sense until there's a perceived sort of moderate position that basically is pro-gun rights, pro-carrying, but with greater restrictions. There's too much polarization on the issue. And so I think people who are generally in favor of gun rights are not going to look askance at a gun rights measure that may go beyond what they feel comfortable with, as long as the alternative is something that they definitely don't feel comfortable with, which is greater controls on the right to carry.
Yeah, I think that really hits the nail on the head there as to the dynamic in that Georgia gubernatorial election. Stacey Abrams, it did seem like at points tried to present a more moderate position on guns than even perhaps Warnock, for instance, where, I know she, in comments to us, we interviewed Kemp early on in the race, and Stacey Abrams' campaign responded to our questions. And it felt like her position was more, she doesn't like permitless carry, but the campaign tried to paint it as she's more of a moderate on this issue. Like she wants some more restrictions. She doesn't like what Kemp is pushing to remove. But then, of course, I think her comments herself, she made a couple comments about wanting to, outlaw more firearms, or the possession of more firearms. And so I think it was hard for her to campaign to strike that balance. And ultimately, most of their rhetoric was more on the restrictive side and less on we're just looking to keep things the way they are or do minor changes, if that makes sense. And it's probably, and you're right, I think the national perception of her as this sort of progressive hero probably added to that too.
Yeah. And I think also, we don't have anybody who campaigns on the following position: I think things are basically where they ought to be, and I don't want to move them any farther. I mean, that just doesn't make for good campaign copy. And so I don't think Stacey Abrams had a convincing case that basically she believed in things like campus carry and, permitted carry, by right. And she was worried about, she just didn't want to go to permitless carry. I mean, that's just not a position that I think it's too nuanced, for one thing, sort of for the airwaves. And second, it's just not the kind of position that people take up. People run, if they're not incumbents, against the status quo. They don't say, basically, I just want to lock in where we are now. That's especially true when your base is virulently opposed to where we are now. So I think that it's just a hard position, and I'm not sure it's a great issue for her to run on in Georgia, other than to try and turn out her base. But as far as appealing to the middle, I just don't think it's easy to make a convincing case that it's just permitless carry that she was worried about, and then to cleave off those voters. I don't think politics works that way. People have general ideas when they walk into the voting booth. This candidate is essentially going to protect my right to carry a firearm and own a firearm under whatever conditions that might be. And that candidate wants to ban more gun designs and wants to make it harder for me to purchase one the next time I go to the store. And that's how people break it down. I think when you're in a legislative session, things are a little bit more nuanced. But in a general statewide campaign like this, I just don't think people are breaking things down that much. And candidates that try and create those fine distinctions have a hard time messaging.